Good morning, sixth grade remote learners. So today, lesson 2, we're doing this on Wednesday, September 16th, is about telling time. Now, it's not necessarily about telling time like, it's 2 o'clock or it's lunchtime or it's bedtime. Instead, we're going to talk about how to know basically what a century is. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what AD and BC are. Okay. So first of all, just start with the definition here. A century. So when we talk about history, oftentimes we'll talk about century. We don't necessarily talk about decades because that's only 10 years. Instead, we might talk about centuries, which is a period of 100 years. All right. So that's the definition of century, a period of 100 years. And you can see, like, if you start in year 1 to year 100, well, that space in between is the first period of 100 years. So that would be the first century. And this, from year 100 to year 200, is the second period of 100 years, right? That's the first period. That's the first section of 100 years. That's the first century. That's the second section. So that's the second century. That's the third section. So that's the third century. Hopefully this is making sense to you. Where this gets a little bit confusing, though, is if you actually picked a random number in between. So let's say we took the year 250, right? So if we took the year 250, it's actually in the third century, right? That's the first period of 100 years, the second period, and then the third period of 100 years. So that's where sometimes it gets a little bit confusing when we look at centuries, because the number starts with a 2, even though the century is the third. So let me see what this looks like in today's time, right? So this right here, from year 2000 to year 2100, is going to be a period of 100 years. That's a century. And if we kept this pattern going, it'd be the 21st century. So again, that's where it just gets a little bit confusing. It's not necessarily intuitive because our year starts 2020, starts with 20, but it's the 21st century. So whenever you're dealing with centuries, you basically just have to add a number. Okay. So like if we were talking about when the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts in 1620. Well, even though it's 1620, that would be the 17th century because they did that in the 17th period of 100 years. Okay, so hopefully you don't get confused by that because sometimes as a teacher, we might go back and forth between talking about the 1600s and then the 17th century, but we're actually talking about the same thing, right? Because a period of 100 years, and if you pick a year within that period, it's going to start with a different number than what the century does. All right. So the homework assignment that I gave you, or the remote assignment I gave you, asks you to, I give you an event and the year it took place, and you have to do a little bit of research to tell me what continent it took place in, right? So North America, South America, Antarctica, Australia, Africa, Europe, and Asia. So you have to tell me what continent it occurred in, and then you have to tell me the century. Okay, so I'm going to give you some background information. I'm going to tell you the specific year, but you have to give me a little bit more information by doing a little bit of what I call gentle research. The other thing I want to talk about is BC and AD. Okay, so BC means before Christ, and AD means Anno Domini, which means in the year of the Lord, or sometimes people say in the year of our Lord. There is no year 0. Okay, so oops, that's a typo there. That should be a number 1. All right. So we have a year 1 AD and a year 1 BC. BC happened first. Okay. So things like dinosaurs, early man, even the pyramids. Now, these were built thousands and thousands and thousands of years apart, sometimes even millions of years apart. But this all happened in what we call BC. The time that is closer to us, in fact, the time that we live in, would be AD. So sometimes we don't necessarily use AD. Like I wouldn't write the year 2020 AD, or even, when the Civil War ended in 1865, I wouldn't write AD because it's kind of assumed. But when we see BC, we know that's older, all right? And we know that AD is newer. And BC, it actually counts basically using negative numbers. So, for instance, when there was a Stegosaurus around, that would be 95 million BC, okay? So that number is larger because it gets further away. The same way if we were doing negative numbers, negative 100 is further away from 0 than negative 10. Okay. So again, BC is what happened before. Okay. And then now we're in present day, we're dealing in AD. The bigger the number in BC, the further away we go. The bigger the number in AD, well, the further we are to the present or even in the future. Okay. So I'll talk